The hallway smelled like freshly waxed floors and pencil shavings, just like the first week of school always did. Classroom doors were wide open, filled with the soft buzz of introductions, name games, and lunchbox comparisons. It was the kind of September morning that made everything feel possible. New notebooks, new shoes, new beginnings. Room 2B was no different. Posters of animals wearing graduation caps lined the walls. A tiny bookshelf overflowed with picture books, most of them donated and well-loved. In the front of the room stood a tall, elegant woman in her 30s, dressed in a neat navy blue blouse and slacks, her locks tied back in a low bun. Her presence didn't demand attention, but it drew it. Calm, steady, warm. Her name was Ms. Bennett. She had spent the entire summer preparing for this, her first full-time teaching job since graduating from her education program. And she didn't take it lightly. She had laminated every student's name tag by hand. She had written personalized welcome letters for each desk. She had memorized every name on the roster. What she hadn't prepared for was the man standing at the door. He was tall, white, mid-40s, business casual with an expensive watch and a colder stare. He stood there, arms crossed, eyes narrowed. Not at her, but through her. His son, Evan, clung to his pant leg. She smiled anyway. "Good morning, Evan Wright. We're so happy to have you." The man didn't respond. His eyes scanned her up and down, lingering just long enough to make his point without saying a word. Evan, meanwhile, had already slipped inside, instantly distracted by a stack of Legos near the reading corner. Finally, the man said flatly, "Is there someone else I can speak to? Administration?" Ms. Bennett paused for a second, just enough to register the intent, but not enough to give it power. "They're just down the hall," she said, her voice steady. "But I'd be happy to answer any questions." He didn't thank her. He didn't smile. He just turned on his heel and walked off. 10 minutes later, the principal came by, flustered but composed. "Ms. Bennett, would you mind stepping into my office during your planning period?" She knew what it was about before it was even spoken. She had heard the tone before, soft, managerial, the kind used when something uncomfortable needs to be said without actually saying it. Still, she smiled and nodded. "Of course. Let me just settle the kids first." Back in the classroom, Evan sat cross-legged on the rug, listening intently as Ms. Bennett read aloud, "The Day You Begin," a story about what it feels like to be different on the first day of school. And for a moment, it felt like just another ordinary start to the year, until she looked toward the doorway again and saw the man watching, not his son, not the other kids, just her. The principal's office smelled faintly of burnt coffee and copy machine toner, 2 scents Ms. Bennett was learning to associate with bureaucracy. She sat upright in the cushioned chair across from the desk, hands folded gently in her lap, her posture composed but her breath shallow. She had been in schools long enough to recognize the tone of a "we just want to get ahead of this conversation." Principal Howard cleared his throat before speaking, though the hesitation had already said enough. "I just wanted to make sure you're all right," he began, eyes darting from his desk to hers. "We had a parent stop by this morning, Mr. Wallace, Evan's father." She nodded, waiting. He expressed some concerns about classroom assignments. Still, she said nothing, because she knew and because the principal wanted her to say it first. He said he wasn't comfortable with the current arrangement. Now she spoke. "Because I'm new?" The principal winced. "No, not exactly." A pause, and then, "Because you're black." The words fell into the space like a dropped file cabinet, heavy, jarring, inescapable. No raised voices, no insults, just a fact laid bare on a desk between them, and the expectation that she would be the one to make it easier to digest. Ms. Bennett took a breath, then another, before speaking. "And what did you say to that?" Howard adjusted his glasses, buying himself time he didn't deserve. "I told him that we don't accommodate requests based on that you're fully qualified, that we stand behind our staff." He sounded rehearsed, like a man who had practiced allyship in the mirror, but never needed to test it in real life. But he was insistent. He asked for a transfer. "To a white teacher," she said, finishing the thought he couldn't. He didn't deny it. Back in her classroom, the students were finishing their first art project. drawing what makes them feel safe. Evan was quietly coloring a picture of a tree with long branches and a smiling woman standing underneath. Miss Bennet lingered at her desk a moment longer, staring at her own reflection in the dark screen of her laptop. She didn't look angry. She didn't look hurt. She looked tired. Already. She stood, smoothed her blouse, and walked back to 2B. Because whatever was said about her, she still had 21 children waiting to be seen. It wasn't a conversation anymore. It was a form typed, printed and submitted to the main office with deliberate neatness. Request for class reassignment. Reason? Philosophical difference with assigned teacher's approach, but everyone who saw it knew what it really meant. The office assistant didn't ask questions. She just stamped it, filed it, and emailed the principal. Meanwhile, in room 2B, Miss Bennet stood at the whiteboard, teaching the class how to break big numbers into smaller groups, place value. Her voice was calm, confident, and warm, pausing just enough to let each idea land. She called on every child equally. She crouched down to their level when they were confused. She cheered when they got it right. And Evan was focused. He liked numbers. They were clean, predictable, fair, unlike the conversation he had heard in the car that morning. "You don't need to listen to someone who doesn't understand our values," his father had said. "I'll make sure you're in a different class by next week." But when Miss Bennet had leaned down earlier that day, looked him in the eye and said, "You have a sharp brain, Evan. I'm proud of how you're thinking." Something warm had settled in his chest. Something unfamiliar. That afternoon, Miss Bennet received the email subject, "Transfer request Evan Wallace." She read it 3 times. She didn't cry. She didn't sigh. She just minimized the window, stood up, and walked to the reading corner where Evan sat, nose deep in Charlotte's Web. "Hey, Evan," she said gently, "would you like to read the next chapter together?" He nodded, eyes lighting up, and as they read aloud, his voice small but steady, he didn't know he was leaving, and she didn't tell him he might be gone, because at that moment, what mattered wasn't his last name or her skin color. It was the way he said, "Some pig," and the way she laughed. That night, the house was quiet in the way only large homes can be. Too many walls, too much space between voices. Evan sat at the kitchen table with a bowl of cereal in front of him, long since gone soggy. His backpack leaned against the chair, his name stitched cleanly on the back in blue thread. Across from him sat his father, scrolling silently through his phone, tapping with mechanical impatience. "Dad?" No response. "Dad, can I ask something?" This time the tapping stopped. The man looked up, not annoyed, not angry, but distracted, as if summoned from a world more important than this one. "What's on your mind, sport?" Evan hesitated. His small fingers traced circles around the edge of the cereal bowl. His legs swung under the chair, never quite touching the floor. "Why don't you like my teacher?" The question hung in the air longer than it should have. The man blinked, then leaned back in his chair. "It's not about her, it's about what's right for you." "But she's nice." That made his father's mouth tighten. Not quite a frown, just a small invisible withdrawal. "You're too young to understand these things. There are certain values our family believes in, certain ways things should be." "Because she's black." Silence. That word spoken so plainly, so honestly, without weight or hesitation, not as a slur, not as a weapon, just a color, just a truth. The father cleared his throat. "Finish your cereal." Upstairs, Evan sat on his bed, legs crossed, a crumpled drawing in his lap. He had made it earlier that week. Miss Bennet standing in front of a big oak tree, holding an open book, while all the kids sat around her smiling. He had drawn her smiling too. He turned it over and stared at the blank side. Then he reached for his markers, and slowly, carefully, drew a small boy in the corner of the page, watching from behind a wall. He didn't know what the picture meant, but something inside him felt like it did. Downstairs, the father stood at the sink, staring out the window. He didn't touch his drink, didn't scroll anymore. He just stood there, realizing for the first time that his son had asked a question he couldn't answer. The next morning, room 2B was unusually still. Not the focused stillness of engaged learning, but that uneasy quiet that settles when something unspoken has entered a space, and everyone, even the children, can feel it. Miss Bennet stood at the front of the classroom, marker in hand, writing out a list of new vocabulary words for the week. Her handwriting was precise, looping slightly to the right, each word written with care, as if the way the letters touched the board might somehow soften the way the world touched her. Behind her, the students sat quietly at their desks, watching. Not all of them, but enough. The ones who had heard their parents talking the night before, the ones who weren't sure what diversity hire meant, but knew it didn't sound like a compliment, the ones who weren't sure whether they were allowed to raise their hands as quickly as before. She felt it, not in the words but in their absence, in the way eyes darted toward one another before answering questions, in the sudden shyness from students who had been bubbling with curiosity just a day earlier. And from Evan, no words, but eyes that lingered longer than usual, not suspicious, not cold, just confused. She continued the lesson anyway. "Today we're learning about perspective," she said, underlining the word on the board. "Can anyone tell me what that means?" No hands. "Okay," she continued, unfazed. "Perspective is how we see things. And sometimes—" She paused. Not because she didn't know how to finish the sentence, but because she suddenly realized she wasn't speaking to a room full of children anymore. Not really. She was speaking to their living rooms, to their dinner tables, to their inherited assumptions. Sometimes, she said finally, it's not that what we're seeing is wrong, it's that we were taught to look from only one window. In the back row, Evan's hand twitched. He didn't raise it, but he looked at her. Really looked. And in that moment she saw something break free from his gaze, a sliver of a question, a flicker of doubt, the early signs of a child beginning to unlearn something. She didn't call on him, she just nodded and turned back to the board. At recess, Miss Bennet sat at her desk alone, sipping from a chipped coffee mug that said, "Books are magic." Outside the window, the children ran across the playground, laughter echoing through the cracked glass. A few girls played hopscotch. 2 boys argued over who would be goalie. Evan sat under the jungle gym, hugging his knees, staring at the mulch. He didn't cry, but he didn't smile either. He didn't know it yet, but something in him had changed, not loudly, not all at once, but in the quiet way that roots begin to shift beneath the soil before a tree grows in a new direction. Inside the classroom still smelled faintly of whiteboard ink and sharpened pencils, but the air had changed, because silence, when born of prejudice, is not absence, it's presence, and Miss Bennet was learning to teach even in its wait. The cafeteria had been repurposed for the meeting, folding chairs lined in tight rows, a podium near the milk fridge, and the flickering overhead lights casting uneven shadows against the linoleum floor. It was a space meant for birthday cupcakes and PTA flyers. But tonight it felt more like a courtroom. Parents filed in one by one, some dressed in business casual, others still in work uniforms, many with arms crossed before they'd even sat down. Conversations buzzed in low, guarded tones. The phrase, "You know," ever since she started, floated just loud enough to reach Miss Bennet's ears. She sat alone at the front, not behind the podium, but beside it. No speech, no notes, just her, a plain chair, and a calmness that looked like courage, but was really just fatigue, polished into discipline. Principal Howard stepped forward first, cleared his throat and delivered the kind of safe, prepared speech that fills space without meaning. "We want to thank you all for coming. It's important that we foster dialogue, that we hear all voices, and that we create a space where everyone feels represented." He kept going. She stopped listening because she knew she wasn't there to be represented. She was there to be dissected. And yet, she didn't flinch. Finally, Howard turned to her. "Miss Bennet, would you like to say a few words?" She stood slowly, adjusting the sleeves of her navy cardigan. Her heels clicked softly against the floor as she stepped forward, not to the podium, but to the center of the room. She looked not at the ceiling, not at the principal, but directly at the parents. And then she spoke. "I know some of you are uncomfortable." She let that sit. "Maybe not with me as a person. Maybe just with what I represent. You don't know me. You've never spoken to me. But you've seen my skin, and you've decided what kind of teacher I must be." Murmurs stirred, but no one interrupted. "Let me tell you what I am. I am the first person in my family to graduate college. I have a master's degree in childhood education and trauma-informed learning. I've spent the last 7 years tutoring students whose names no one could pronounce until their test scores made headlines. I've eaten lunch in classrooms with kids who forgot theirs, bought books with my own paycheck, and graded papers while my mother was dying in hospice. She swallowed hard but didn't break. I didn't come here to make you comfortable. I came here to teach. The room was quiet now. Not hostile, not tense, just quiet. That kind of quiet that falls when people are being forced to look at themselves in someone else's reflection. If you want to know who I am, she said finally, softer now, you can ask me, I'll answer. If you want to know how I teach, come observe. But if you're only here to whisper and request transfers, I can't help you. Not because I don't care, but because your child deserves a teacher who isn't afraid to stand in front of them without flinching. She walked back to her seat without waiting for applause, because this wasn't a performance, it was survival. And the ones who truly understood were too moved to clap. It was art day in room 2B, colored pencils lined neatly in little trays, construction paper fanned across each desk like autumn leaves, and soft jazz playing quietly from a Bluetooth speaker tucked behind the globe. Ms. Bennett gave the instructions with her usual calm. Draw something that makes you feel safe. The room hummed with quiet concentration. A girl drew her dog. A boy sketched his grandmother's arms. Someone painted a race car with eyes. And Evan didn't draw right away. He stared at the blank paper, pencil in hand, heart in his throat, because he knew what he wanted to draw, and he didn't know if he was allowed to. Eventually he began small lines, curved arms, a woman standing beneath a tall tree, holding an open book. Around her, children sat in a circle, smiling, their faces little dots of joy. He colored her blouse blue, her hair pulled back, her face soft. He looked up briefly, just once, and Ms. Bennett across the room met his eyes. She smiled, then turned away to help another student, and that smile made his hands move faster, more confidently. At the bottom, in thick crayon letters, he wrote, "Ms. B makes me feel okay." That evening, Evan packed the drawing carefully into his folder. At home, he slid it out onto the kitchen table. "I made this today," he said, voice light. "It's Ms. Bennett. She reads to us like this." His father didn't look right away, just nodded absently while loosening his tie. Then he turned, eyes falling on the drawing. He froze. Something flickered in his face. Recognition, irritation, disbelief. And then, in a single jarring motion, he picked it up and tore it in half. "We've talked about this," he said, voice low but sharp. "You don't need to be drawing her like that. Enough." Evan's lips parted, but nothing came out. He stared at the ripped pieces in his father's hand, his fingers curling under the table as if gripping something that wasn't there anymore. The next morning, Miss Bennett emptied the small recycling bin beside her desk. On top of crumpled worksheets and glue-stained scraps, she saw it, the drawing, torn clean through the middle. Miss Bennett's drawn face split apart, but the words still faintly visible. "Ms. B makes me feel okay." She didn't gasp, didn't ask questions. She just quietly unfolded the pieces, smoothed them out, and slipped them between 2 pages of her lesson plan binder. And when Evan walked into the room that morning, eyes a little lower, steps a little slower, she greeted him like nothing had changed, because he didn't need to know she'd found it. And yet, he looked at her like maybe he did. The bulletin board outside room 2B was freshly decorated with stars, ribbons, and construction paper rockets. At the top, in glittery letters, it read, "My Future Self Week." Every teacher had been asked to share their personal story, where they came from, what they dreamed of as kids, and how they ended up where they were now. Some read simple stories about college. Others showed baby pictures, report cards, sports trophies. Ms. Bennett didn't bring props. She brought truth. The class gathered in a semicircle on the rug, knees bouncing, eyes wide. Evan sat in the second row, legs crossed, hands tucked under his thighs, already watching her before she even spoke. She stood at the front of the room, not behind a desk, not holding a slideshow remote, just herself. "When I was your age," she began, "I thought teachers were superheroes. Not because they had powers, but because they noticed things. They noticed when I was quiet, when I didn't have lunch, when I wore the same sweater every day. Her voice didn't rise, it flowed. I grew up in a neighborhood where schools didn't have books with spines, where teachers left every year because it was too hard, where I never had anyone who looked like me standing at the front of the room. The children didn't fidget, didn't whisper. They just listened. But I had a library card, and I had a mother who prayed out loud while scrubbing the floor, and I had this tiny flame inside me that said, "Someday, you'll be the one who notices." She paused, not to dramatize, just to breathe. Unbeknownst to her, just beyond the classroom door, half shielded by the glass window, stood Mr. Wallace. He had come to drop off a permission slip. He stayed to listen, arms folded, not in defiance, but in a way that said, "I don't know why I haven't left yet." Back in the room, Miss Bennet smiled and said, "That's why I'm here, because every child deserves someone who stays, someone who listens, someone who sees them before anyone else tells them what they are." Afterward, the class clapped, not because they were told to, but because they felt something, even Evan, especially Evan. Miss Bennet gathered her notes. The room buzzed again, and outside Mr. Wallace stood frozen for just a second longer, as if the ground beneath him had tilted slightly. Then, silently, he turned and walked away. But he wasn't walking the same. The following week passed like a wound that never quite scabbed. Classes continued, lunch was served, homework was assigned, but something had shifted, not loudly, not in headlines, but in the undercurrent of the school day. No official apology came, no email, no phone call, not even a hallway nod. Mr. Wallace never acknowledged what he'd said, never admitted what he'd done, and yet Evan was still in the classroom. Each morning he walked in quieter, he listened longer. He raised his hand more than before, not because his father had changed, but because he had. Miss Bennet never asked why Evan hadn't been transferred. She never brought up the torn drawing, never changed her tone, never altered her warmth. But she did one thing, just once. On a Monday morning, after a particularly long week, she slipped a folded paper into Evan's take-home folder. It was the drawing, taped back together, edges rough, lines crooked but whole. On the back, in her neat handwriting, it said, "What you see matters. Keep seeing." Evan didn't say anything, but the next day he brought her a drawing of a tree, and this time he drew himself sitting beside her. Meanwhile, in the staff lounge, two teachers talked softly over coffee. "I don't know how she keeps showing up like that," one whispered. After what that man said, the other just shook her head. "Because she doesn't show up for him. She shows up for them." And she did, every day, without a podium, without validation, without an apology, because some people wait for the world to change, and others get up every morning and change it anyway. It happened on a Thursday. Recess had just started, and the playground was alive with its usual chaos, screams of tag, the clang of jump ropes on concrete, the rhythmic creak of swings under tiny legs chasing air. Evan was near the slide, holding a worn-out basketball that wasn't even his. He wasn't trying to play, he was just there. A group of older boys from another class came over. Not to play, to provoke. "You don't belong here," one of them muttered. "Why are you always hanging around the baby class?" Evan shrugged, unsure whether to reply. "He's the one with the weird teacher, right?" "Yeah, the one my dad said is always acting like she's better than everyone else." Evan didn't defend her, not because he agreed, but because the words hit too fast, too loud. Before he could even think of a response, one of the boys shoved him, not hard enough to injure, but hard enough to humiliate. His small frame toppled sideways onto the bark chips, the basketball rolling out of reach. A scrape bloomed across his elbow. His lip trembled, his pride shattered, and then, without warning, he cried. Not like a child who wants attention, like a child who realizes the world isn't safe, even when he's done nothing wrong. The yard monitor didn't see it. The other kids kept playing, but from the classroom window, Ms. Bennet saw everything, and by the time Evan looked up through tear-blurred eyes, she was already there. She didn't ask what happened, didn't demand names, didn't scold or raise her voice. She knelt beside him, her knees in the dirt, and wrapped her arms around his shaking shoulders. No words, just warmth, just protection, just what he needed, in the exact moment he needed it. He clung to her without hesitation, not like a student, Not like someone trained to obey, but like a child who had just realized who was safe and who was not. Later, as she walked him back inside, his arm in hers, bandage on his elbow, he looked up at her and whispered, "Why are you still nice to me?" She smiled, sad and soft. "Because I see you." That night, Evan didn't mention the fight to his father, but when he sat down to draw before bed, he didn't draw trees or teachers. He drew a small boy on the ground and someone kneeling beside him, not saving him, just staying. That night, the house was unusually quiet. Dinner sat untouched on the table, pasta, overcooked vegetables, and the same silence they'd been serving all week. Evan poked at his food without looking up, his fingers sticky from the Band-Aid peeling at the edge of his elbow. Across from him, Mr. Wallace scrolled through emails on his phone, half listening to the nightly news in the background. "Did something happen at school today?" he asked casually, eyes still glued to the screen. Evan didn't answer right away, but he put his fork down, carefully, softly. Then he lifted his eyes and said, "You weren't there." The father blinked, caught off guard. "What do you mean, sir?" "When I fell, when those boys pushed me, when they said stuff about Miss Bennett." A pause. "You weren't there." Mr. Wallace sat up straighter, sensing the shift. "Why didn't you tell the teacher?" "I didn't have to. She saw me. She ran to me, before anyone else did, before I even knew I was crying." His voice cracked slightly, but he didn't stop. "You told me she's not like us, that I shouldn't trust her, but she's the only one who did." Silence. "You know what's funny?" he added, voice steadying. "You say she shouldn't teach me because of her skin, but she's the only adult who actually sees me." The words didn't echo, they didn't need to. They just sat in the room like smoke after a fire, not choking, just lingering. Mr. Wallace tried to speak. "Son, I was only trying to—" But Evan cut in. "To protect me? From what?" "You weren't protecting me. You were protecting yourself from having to admit someone you don't understand is better at loving me than you were today." And then Evan stood, not like a boy asking permission, but like someone who had found his own ground. He took his plate to the sink, rinsed it quietly, and went upstairs. His father didn't follow, didn't call his name. He just sat there, surrounded by food he didn't want, and a truth he had never tasted before. It was raining when Mr. Wallace returned to room 2B. Not a storm, just a soft, steady drizzle, the kind that soaks your collar before you realize you've been outside too long. He didn't bring an umbrella, didn't rehearse what he'd say. He just walked in, hat in hand, humility and posture, and the weight of his son's voice still echoing in the seams of his coat. Miss Bennett was preparing for the next lesson, stacking flashcards, organizing phonics sheets, setting out sharpened pencils like she always did. Her back was to the door. She didn't turn when she heard it open, because she already knew. He cleared his throat, once, twice, then finally spoke. "I was wrong." Not loud, not dramatic, just real. "I made a decision for my son based on fear, not facts, based on what I thought I was protecting him from, not what I was keeping him from. And I can't take it back, but I'd like to ask if he can stay in this class with you." She didn't answer at first, didn't rush. She turned slowly, placed her papers down and met his eyes. And then she said the one sentence she'd been holding since day one. "Your son never left." He didn't respond, didn't cry, didn't smile. But something in his chest exhaled for the first time in weeks. The next morning, Evan entered the room as if nothing had happened, and that was exactly how it should be. He placed his backpack on the hook, slid into his seat, and opened his notebook. But when he looked up, he saw something new. At the back of the room, next to the bookshelf, a chair. Not a desk, not a command center, just a place to sit. And his father, silent, watchful, changed, sat in it, not to interfere, not to dominate, to witness. Because some things you fix with apologies, others you fix by showing up, again and again. Outside, the rain had stopped. Inside, something softer had begun. And at the front of the room, Miss Bennett kept teaching, not because she had to, but because someone in that room finally understood why she did. If this story moved you, don't just scroll past, hit that like button, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe to Black Canvas for more stories where justice speaks softly but echoes forever.